In the mid-13th century, the known world was trembling between two distinct forms of terror. To the east, rising from the cold steppes of Mongolia, was a force of nature, a military machine of unprecedented speed, discipline, and brutality that had already swallowed empires whole. This was the terror of the thunderous charge, the darkened sky of arrows, and the smoking ruin of cities that dared to resist. It was the terror of total war. But hidden away in the jagged, inaccessible peaks of the Elburz Mountains of northern Persia, there existed a different kind of fear. It was a fear not of armies, but of the shadow in the corner of the room, the trusted advisor turning traitor, the silent blade in the crowded market. This was the domain of the Nizari Ismailis, known to their enemies and to history as the Assassins. For nearly 2 centuries they had held kings, sultans, and crusaders hostage through the precise application of political murder. They were the masters of asymmetric warfare, believing that no fortress was too high and no monarch too guarded to be reached by their devoted agents. History is often defined by the collision of opposing forces, but rarely has there been a clash so absolute in its contrast. On one side stood the Mongols, the irresistible force of kinetic energy and conquest. On the other stood the Assassins, the immovable object of subterfuge, entrenched in mountain strongholds believed to be impregnable by the standards of human warfare. The world watched with bated breath as the masters of death faced the lords of war. The resulting conflict would not only reshape the map of the Middle East, but would bring a final violent end to one of history's most mysterious and feared organizations. This is the story of what happens when the shadow meets the storm. To understand the magnitude of this collision, one must first understand the unique position the Assassins held in the medieval psyche. Long before the Mongols turned their gaze toward Persia, the Nizari Ismailis had carved out a state within a state. Founded in the late 11th century by the charismatic and brilliant strategist Hassan I Sabah, the order was born out of religious schism and political necessity. Hassan was a revolutionary who found himself outnumbered and surrounded by the powerful Seljuk Turks. He realized that he could never defeat the Sunni empires in open battle. His armies were too small, his resources too few. Instead, he devised a strategy that would bypass the need for conventional warfare entirely. Hassan seized the fortress of Alamut, the Eagle's Nest, perched high atop a narrow ridge in the Elburz Mountains. It was a logistical marvel, commanded by a man who understood that power resided not in the number of soldiers one commanded, but in the psychological hold one had over the enemy. From this mountain fastness, Hassan developed the doctrine of the fidai, the self-sacrificing agent. These were not mindless killers, as later legends would suggest, nor were they drug-addled fanatics acting under the influence of hashish, a myth popularized by Marco Polo and medieval detractors. They were highly trained, deeply educated sleepers who would infiltrate the courts of enemies, serving as scribes, guards, or servants for years, waiting for the signal to strike. The reputation of the order grew to mythical proportions. When a powerful vizier or an opposing general threatened the Ismaili interests, they would be struck down in public, often at high noon on a Friday in the mosque, ensuring maximum visibility. The fidai rarely attempted to escape. Their death was part of the message. The message was simple: no one is safe. This psychological paralysis allowed the assassins to expand their network of castles across Persia and Syria, creating a disjointed but resilient empire of mountaintops. Great leaders like Saladin and the Crusader kings learned to walk softly around the order. They paid tribute. They negotiated. They accepted the assassins as a permanent, if terrifying, fixture of the geopolitical landscape. The order had survived empires. They believed they could survive anything. But the world was changing. While the assassins were perfecting the art of the dagger in the shadows of Persia, a new power had coalesced in the east. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongols had united the warring tribes of the steppe and forged a military instrument the likes of which the world had never seen. By the 1250s, the mantle of leadership had passed to Genghis's grandsons. The great Khan Manka, ruling from the capital of Karakoram, had a vision of universal dominion. To realize this, he dispatched his brother, Hulagu Khan, with a specific mandate: to subdue the Islamic lands of the West, to destroy the caliphate in Baghdad, and to enforce Mongol law all the way to the Mediterranean. However, there was a specific thorn in the side of the Mongol Empire that had to be removed before the march on Baghdad could begin. The assassins had made a fatal miscalculation. In their hubris, they had treated the Mongols, just as they had treated the Seljuks or the Khwarezmians. They believed the Mongols were just another passing dynasty that could be intimidated or managed. There are historical accounts suggesting that the assassins had dispatched Fidai to Karakorum to assassinate Möngke Khan himself. Whether this was a genuine attempt or merely a paranoid rumor that reached the Mongol court, the result was the same. The great Khan was not a man to be threatened. For the Mongols, the ambassador was sacred, and the person of the Khan was divine. To target the Khan was to invite an apocalypse. Hulagu Khan set out in 1253 at the head of a massive army, perhaps the largest Mongol force ever assembled for a Western campaign. This was not a raiding party, it was a migration of conquest. It is said that 1 out of every 10 fighting men in the entire Mongol Empire was conscripted for this expedition. But it wasn't just the numbers that spelled doom for the assassins, it was the technology. The Mongols were not merely horse archers. By this time, they had absorbed the engineering genius of China and the Islamic East. They brought with them a corps of siege engineers, Chinese experts in ballistics, and a baggage train loaded with the components for heavy trebuchets, catastrophe-throwing machines capable of shattering stone walls. As Hulagu moved slowly across Central Asia, the ground literally shook. The assassins, watching from their high towers in the Elburz, must have felt the first twinges of true existential dread. Their strategy relied on the enemy giving up. They relied on sieges being too costly, too long, and too difficult to maintain in the harsh mountain winters. They relied on the fear that the enemy commander might wake up with a dagger on his pillow. But the Mongols were immune to this brand of psychological warfare. You cannot assassinate a swarm. You cannot intimidate a force that views death in battle as a natural eventuality. Furthermore, the Mongol discipline was absolute. The security around Hulagu was impenetrable, far tighter than the loose courts of the Arab and Persian princes. The clash began in earnest in 1256. The Mongol strategy was methodical and suffocating. They did not rush the mountains foolishly. Instead, they moved like a rising tide, isolating the assassin castles one by one. The Ismaili state was not a contiguous territory, it was an archipelago of fortresses. Hulagu understood that if he cut the lines of communication and supply, the castles would become prisons. The Mongols swept through the valleys, slaughtering anyone who offered resistance and burning the crops that sustained the mountain garrisons. The focus of the campaign narrowed to the grim fortress of Maimundiz, where the Grand Master of the Assassins, Rukn-al-Din Kursha, was residing. Rukn-al-Din was not the hardened strategist that Hassan I Sabah had been. He was young, inexperienced, and clearly overwhelmed by the scale of the violence descending upon him. The Mongols brought their Chinese engineers to the foot of the mountain. In the past, the steep slopes had protected the assassins, because heavy siege engines could not be hauled up the vertical inclines. The Mongols solved this with characteristic ingenuity and labor. They dismantled their massive trebuchets, carried them up the slopes piece by piece on the backs of men and mules, and reassembled them on ridges overlooking the fortress. For the first time in their history, the assassins found themselves looking up at their enemy. The bombardment began. Huge stones, tar-soaked projectiles, and naphtha pots rained down on the walls of Maimundiz. The psychological impact was devastating. The assassins were used to looking down on the world, secure in their eagles' nests. Now the sky was falling. Rukn-al-Din Kursha wavered. His advisors were split. Some, the hardliners, wanted to fight to the death, believing that the castle could still hold out through the winter and that the Mongols would eventually be forced to retreat by the snows. Others saw the futility. The Mongol army was not leaving. They were building permanent structures, settling in for a siege of years if necessary. Hulagu sent messengers offering terms: surrender, dismantle the fortifications, and your lives will be spared. Resist, and every living thing will be put to the sword. This was the classic Mongol choice. They offered a binary outcome: submission or annihilation. Rukn-al-Din, hoping to save his people and perhaps his own position as a vassal, chose submission. He descended from the fortress of Maimundiz and prostrated himself before Hulagu Khan. It was a moment of profound historical symbolism. The Grand Master, the heir to the old man of the mountain, the figure who had terrified kings from Cairo to Paris, was now a supplicant in the dust before a Mongol prince. However, the surrender of the Grand Master was only the beginning. The Mongols were not Arrested in merely defeating the leader, they intended to dismantle the organization root and branch. Hulagu treated Rukn al-Din with a calculated courtesy, using him as a pawn. He forced the Grand Master to travel to the other castles, standing before their gates and ordering the garrisons to surrender. One by one, the legendary strongholds of the assassins, castles that had defied capture for 150 years, opened their gates. The garrisons came down, the fortifications were demolished, and the towers were toppled into the valleys. Then came the turn of Alamut itself. Alamut was the spiritual and strategic heart of the order. Its defenses were legendary, its storehouses packed with enough food to last for years, its cisterns full of water. The commander of Alamut initially refused to heed the Grand Master's order to surrender. He looked at his walls and his supplies and believed he could endure. But the morale of the order was broken. Their imam was a captive, their sister castles were smoking ruins. After a brief show of defiance, the garrison of Alamut lost the will to fight. They opened the gates. When the Mongol soldiers entered Alamut, they were stunned by what they found. The chronicler Juvaini, who accompanied Hulagu on this campaign, wrote with begrudging admiration about the quality of the construction. He described storerooms dug deep into the rock, preserving honey, rice, and wine that had been stored there since the time of Hassan as-Sabah, still fresh, and edible. He described the immense library filled with centuries of scientific, philosophical, and theological works. This brings us to one of the great cultural tragedies of the invasion. Juvaini, a Persian scholar in Mongol service, was given permission to salvage what he could from the library of Alamut before it was destroyed. He saved the Qurans and some books of history, but the vast majority of the Ismaili texts, their theological treatises, their scientific discoveries, their own internal records of their history, were condemned as heretical and thrown into the fire. The Mongols did not just want to conquer the assassins, they wanted to erase their memory. Much of what we know today about the order comes from the writings of their enemies, because their own voice was silenced in the ashes of Alamut. With the castles dismantled, the utility of Rukn al-Din Shah was at an end. He had served his purpose. He had delivered the strongholds without the Mongols needing to sacrifice thousands of men in assaults. He was sent on a journey to the court of the great Khan Mongke in Mongolia, ostensibly to offer his submission in person. It was a one-way trip. On the road, or perhaps upon being turned away at the capital, he was executed. His family and his retinue were systematically hunted down. Back in Persia, Hulagu ordered a general massacre of the Nizari Ismailis. The Fidai, the teachers, the garrison troops, thousands were rounded up and put to the sword. The Mongol thoroughness was terrifying. They sought to ensure that the order could never rise again. They hunted them in the cities and in the remote valleys. It was a purge designed to leave no survivors who could carry the torch of the radical Ismaili doctrine. The clash between the Mongols and the assassins serves as a brutal lesson in the evolution of power. The assassins represented the pinnacle of localized, specialized power. They were the masters of their specific environment, the mountains and their specific method, the targeted strike. They punched above their weight by leveraging fear. But the Mongols represented the new reality of the globalizing world. They were an industrial-scale military power that could project overwhelming force across continents. They brought logistics, engineering, and manpower that rendered the localized advantages of the assassins obsolete. The assassins had thrived because their enemies played by a set of rules of politics, of leverage, of fear. The Mongols did not play by these rules. They did not fear death. They did not negotiate with threats, and they did not stop until the enemy was not just defeated, but non-existent. When the Fidai looked into the eyes of the Mongol warriors, they saw a reflection of their own ruthlessness, but magnified 1,000 times and stripped of any mystical pretense. The fall of Alamut in 1256 cleared the path for the Mongol juggernaut, with the assassin threat neutralized and their castles reduced to rubble. Hulagu turned his eyes toward the ultimate prize, Baghdad. The destruction of the assassins was, in many ways, the dress rehearsal for the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate 2 years later. It proved that no reputation, no matter how ancient or sacred, could stand against the Mongol bow and the Chinese catapult. Today, the ruins of Alamut still stand on that high ridge in Iran, crumbling quietly under the sun and snow. For centuries, they were viewed with superstitious dread, a haunted place where the old man of the mountain once plotted the death of kings. The library is gone, the gardens are dust, and the masters of death are long dead. But the story of their fall remains one of the most dramatic chapters in human history. It was the moment when the irresistible force finally met the immovable object, and the object was not just moved, it was shattered. The Mongols proved that while you can kill a man with a dagger, you can only kill an idea with fire and total ruin. They dismantled the physical infrastructure of the assassins so completely that the order was forced to transform. The Nizari Ismailis did survive, but not as a military power. They went underground, scattering across the world, evolving over centuries into a peaceful spiritual community that exists to this day. But the era of the assassin, the time when a shadow on the wall could make an emperor tremble, died there in the mountains, crushed under the boots of the Mongol army. In the end, the Klul. Ash tells us something profound about the nature of fear. The assassins weaponized the fear of the unknown, the hidden threat. The Mongols weaponized the fear of the known, the visible, inevitable destruction. When these two fears collided, the visible terror won. The mystery of the mountains was laid bare, the secret chambers were broken open, and the world learned that even the deadliest assassins are no match for the march of history. As we look back on this violent intersection of empires, we are left with the silence of the Elburz Mountains. It is a silence that speaks of the transience of power. The assassins believed their mountain fortress was the center of the world, an eternal sanctuary. The Mongols believed their empire was the will of the eternal blue sky, destined to last forever. Both are gone now, leaving only stones and stories. But in that brief fiery window of the 13th century, their collision produced a spark that illuminated the brutal changing of the guard, marking the end of the age of castles and the beginning of the age of empires. The Shadow War was over. The era of total war had begun. This transition is critical to understanding the modern world. The Mongol campaigns, specifically the eradication of the assassins, marked a shift in how war was conceived. It was no longer about feudal skirmishes or the check and balance of rival warlords. It was about hegemony. It was about the centralization of violence. The assassins were a relic of a fragile, ended world, a non-state actor playing the great game between empires. The Mongols were the harbingers of the centralized state, capable of mobilizing resources on a level that made non-state resistance futile. We must also consider the intelligence failure that led to the assassins' demise. For over a century, the order had relied on superior intelligence. They knew their enemies better than their enemies knew themselves. They knew which guard could be bribed, which prince was ambitious, which door was unlocked. But with the Mongols, they were blind. They did not understand the steppe culture. They did not understand the loyalty bound by the Yasa, the Mongol code of law. They could not infiltrate the tight-knit tribal units of the Mongol Tumans as easily as they could the cosmopolitan courts of Damascus or Baghdad. Their primary weapon, information, was rendered useless, and what of the Mongol perspective? To Hulagu, the assassins were likely viewed not as a rival military power, but as a pestilence. In the Mongol worldview, order was paramount. Resistance was tolerated if it was open and honorable, followed by submission. But the assassin method, striking from the dark, refusing open battle, killing leaders without a declaration of war, was antithetical to the Mongol warrior ethos. This likely fueled the ferocity of the crackdown. It was an extermination of a method of warfare they deemed dishonorable and chaotic. The siege of Alamut also highlighted the rapid adaptability of the Mongol military. We often picture them on horseback, but at Alamut, they were mountaineers, they were engineers. They constructed elaborate systems of counterweights and pulleys to drag their artillery up 8,000-foot peaks. They diverted rivers, they dug saps and mines. It was a display of military engineering that rivaled Rome at its height. It demonstrated that the Mongol conquest was not a barbarian invasion, but the expansion of a highly sophisticated, technologically advanced superpower. As the dust settled over the ruined castles of the assassins, the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East was irrevocably altered. The power vacuum left by the destruction of the Nizari state and subsequently the caliphate would eventually be filled by new powers, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, the Ilkhanate itself. But the specific niche that the assassins had occupied was closed forever. Never again would a small secret sect hold such sway over the destiny of nations through the threat of the blade alone. The legacy of this clash echoes in the etymology of our own language. The word, assassin itself, traveled back to Europe with the Crusaders and travelers like Marco Polo, forever linking the Nizari Ismailis with political murder. But the true story is far more complex than the linguistic artifact suggests. It is a story of faith, of geology, of engineering, and of the ruthless calculus of survival. When we visualize the final moments of Alamut, we should not just see a battle. We should see the closing of a chapter. Imagine the last defenders of the Eagle's Nest, looking out from their high walls, seeing not just an army, but a sea of iron stretching to the horizon. They must have realized that their time, the time of secrets and shadows, was ending. The thunder of the Mongol trebuchets was the sound of the future arriving, violent and undeniable. And when the walls finally breached, and the light of history flooded into the dark recesses of the assassin's sanctuary, it revealed that even the most terrifying legends are made of flesh and blood, and they bleed just like the rest of us.